Oh, hello, everybody. This is David Lindstedt. It's maybe a little odd to spend just a few moments on the title slide and to talk a little bit about the history of the presentation, but I need to do so for just a moment or two. Yeah, as you probably know, most of the sessions when you are applying for a conference have to be in months ahead of time. And so a lot of the material for this session I had created and gotten already back in the fall of 2019. And since that point, there are two things that have happened. One, I'm sure, is quite obvious, which is COVID-19. But the other is, as I was doing additional research for this presentation, I was looking at research done, particularly from Christchurch and Hurricane Katrina, on protracted disasters. And that leads us down a slightly different path with some other things that we can learn and apply to business continuity. And so with that in mind, there's sort of two parts to two big presentations in a way for this one session. The first part, I guess the best way to frame it up is to talk about a conventional disaster. I mean, we could probably spend 2 hours fighting over the definition of that. That's not what I want to do. What I want to do is say, look, the first part that we're going to be talking about are your more run-of-the-mill conventional disasters, you know, the pipe burst, the flooding, the strike, whatever, things that could take up to months, but maybe just months, as opposed to something like Katrina, the several Christchurch earthquakes, and of course now COVID-19. So there's two presentations wrapped together here. One we can think in, I want to talk about conventional disasters and how to do business continuity for that. And then what we've learned from protracted disasters and what that might mean both to what you're doing now and how we do business continuity in the future. So with that said, I want to give you two caveats. The first is the tone between the two parts will change a little bit. Again, when I put together the first presentation, this was for a live conference. It was supposed to be engaging and entertaining, and we're going to have conversations, and so the tone is a little bit lighter than maybe where we find ourselves today. And as we move into the second part, the tone maybe will be a little bit more somber, as is appropriate for where we find ourselves. The other piece is that in the second presentation, it's going to be text heavy. That's on purpose. I will not talk or read. I will talk to, but not read the text. So no worries there when you see it. That's for you to have those quotes, to have that evidence, to have that research at your disposal as we move into the future and you think back and look back onto this presentation and you might want some additional resources. I want to set the scope very quickly for what we're talking about. This is all about business continuity. So this is not necessarily the things that we talk about now, not necessarily applicable to crisis management, emergency management, enterprise risk management, IT disaster recovery, all the different umbrella disciplines that work together. We really are focusing on business continuity. Now, the things that we're talking about may well apply to some of these other disciplines, but that is not the point. And business continuity, we don't need to go into a lot of detail here, but we're not talking about resilience or organizational resilience. Again, I think resilience is an interdiscipline like public policy, which brings together many related disciplines, but is not a discipline in itself. Organizational resilience, and we know very little about it and why it works, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But business continuity is not meant to be this overreaching resilience or organizational resilience. Business continuity better have its own expertise, its own body of knowledge, its own value proposition that it brings, or we are going to be out of jobs and we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. Business continuity does have these things. It does have its own body of knowledge, and we should continue to get very clear on what that is and continue to work on offering that value proposition. So speaking of resilience, there is, and we need to say this up front, There's very little research on what organizations actually do in post-disaster situations. You can look out there a lot. There are case studies, there are anecdotes. You, of course, may have lived through a disaster situation. You certainly know colleagues that have gone through them. And we discuss this and we talk about case studies and what actually happened. But as far as real research as to what did they actually do, not really what do you remember doing, but what did you do and when did you do it, and did it matter? Did it have an effect? What was the outcome from these kinds of actions and activities? What happened to the organization 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the road? We have very little research on those types of things. What that means is that for the first part, we're going to have to focus somewhat more anecdotally on what we think to be the case and what we've learned through these kinds of conversations and case studies, and apply that to business continuity. In the second part, we have a little bit more research, again, from Christchurch and Hurricane Katrina, that we can apply and talk about that as well. But we should say that this is all a big caveat here as well. That more research needs to be done and focused on this so that we can continue to refine the value proposition. All right, so part one, let's talk about the sort of commonplace disasters, the commonplace business continuity situations, preparing for them, strategizing for them, and in our conversations together, in our journal articles, in our sessions together, in our conferences, heaven forbid, afterwards at the bar where we talk about what the heck really happened and how we're feeling about things, what actually works in a post-disaster situation. Well, what we know, I think it's very clear now, binders, detailed instructions don't work. And I'll be talking about what does work here in a minute. But I think we need to say this. Look, following a disaster, very, very few people find help in a long, detailed list of instructions. Well, why is that? Well, first of all, there's very limited time to read and process the information in a lot of information, regardless of how well written it might be. Post-disaster situations are fluid. They move quickly. Decisions have to be made with limited and conflicting information, and the binders of instructions aren't going to help you do that. You also don't have much access, depending on how bad the disaster is, to your frontal cortex. The creative thinking, the rational thinking, most of that goes away. We'll talk about that in a minute too. And your amygdala takes over a lot of your brain functions, and you are not thinking clearly or properly. And quite frankly, there's a limited fit, I think, to what we can imagine and write down and describe in a sequence of actions that is going to fit any post-disaster situation. We really need to think in terms of portfolios of responses, not individual binders of instructions that bring us through a disaster. Well, how did we get here? Look, I think, and we'll talk about what to do instead in just a minute, but we ought to think about how we got here. Part of it is, I think, the situations we were facing, the culture, just the way businesses do business back in the 80s and 90s with mainframes and Y2K and those types of things. It was perhaps a little easier to write documentation, but of course, we have a hard time proving our value proposition. We haven't taken to measuring very carefully or being able to quantify the improvements in the value proposition that we bring to the table with business continuity. And so instead of, since we don't have anything else, they say, well, paper is the next best thing. And like, okay, if I can't tell whether your program is doing anything or just sitting watching YouTube all day, then I'm going to look at paper, and that's going to be auditors, regulators, and quite frankly, all of us. It's a reinforcing cycle. Look, one of the things we need to recognize is that post-disaster situations are very complicated, particularly in big disasters. And one of the things we ought to, there's a couple of things we ought to recognize. One of the things we ought to recognize is there is a very significant difference between a 4-hour power outage or an internet outage because someone put a backhoe into the fiber, and you know, the loss of an entire building all of a sudden, with losses of lives perhaps. These are different situations, and the environment, the context around a post-disaster situation can be very complicated, and it can be changing very quickly. And we need to recognize that as part of our planning as well. Binders of documentation are not going to adequately prepare us for the complex landscape of a post-disaster environment. And in fact, there are many factors which are going to come into play here, not just what has happened to us, but what is the culture of our organization and our departments in being able to respond to that? Are we authoritative? Are we flat? Do we have good leaders? What are we allowed to do? Are we allowed to make decisions and take innovative steps at a low level, or do we have to get permission from things? What's the market doing? What are our competitors doing? Have they been hurt more than we have? Are they taking advantage of the situation? What are our customers doing? What do they think? What do they need? What are they buying? How are they reacting? What is the narrative going around with what has happened? Is it just something that's happened to us? Was it our fault that it happened to us? Have we hurt other people? Have we affected our customers? Or is this something that we're the victims and now we have sympathy from our customers? What's happening with our stakeholders, our stockholders, our board? Again, what day of the week is it? What time of the year is it? What were we going to deliver tomorrow? What are we doing? Again, this is why there should be business continuity professionals, but only with the realization that the post-disaster environment is a very complex environment to manage, and to be able to prepare adequately for that takes some doing. Well, what does work if documentation doesn't? Checklists. So a great book, you probably all well know it, the Checklist Manifesto, talking about, look, what do sports teams do? What does the military do? What do airline pilots do? And in this case, the author of this was a surgeon. What do surgeons do? Well, they don't have binders of documents of things to do and detailed instructions where things go wrong. What do they have? Checklists. Now, these aren't checklists that you come up with just in 5 minutes and throw it down and there you go. These are very well thought out and tested checklists to see if they provide the information that's needed. But anything, diagrams, cheat sheets, infographics, look, one size does not fit all for business continuity planning. We ought to take that quite seriously. That means that a checklist for one team might not work, whereas a cheat sheet or a diagram or an infographic or a funny picture, who knows? Whatever it is that works for that team, for those responders in that culture, within that organization and their environment, with their background and their history and their culture, how does that all fit together? But it's not going to be in a detailed set of instructions. And so, again, the question, can I see the plan for your organization, is almost ludicrous on the face of it. How could there be a document which talks about all the things to cover all scenarios for what an entire organization is going to do in a post-disaster situation? And right there, we're on the wrong foot, too. If we talk about our job as business continuity planners to create the plan and update the plan and make sure it's got the most recent phone numbers, and every 6 months I'm going to revise the plan, and every year or two we're going to exercise the plan, the focus is entirely wrong. We're focusing on documentation instead of capabilities. This brings us to was it Prussian Field Marshal Helmut von Eltke, and we all have these quotes, or see these quotes at least, that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And we have our Eisenhower quote that it's not the plan that matters, but the planning is everything. And we can bring out Sun Tzu and our other people that we refer to. But we ought to move away from the idea that we have some sort of fixed plan or documentation that we could show or keep to ourselves that is going to be really helpful. So instead of documentation, and in addition to checklists, what I think works is guiding principles. In a recent article, we'll be talking about McKinsey and Company. I have no affiliation with them. They talked about in working with COVID-19 and teams. We'll see that later on. They called it the broad direction of travel. We could think of it as the rules of engagement, the commander's intent. We're not going for, so let's take a department like payroll. I don't want to write out all the things that payroll should do in all the different situations in order to respond to a disaster. What I want to do is work with them to understand why what they do is important. And in particularly, what is their role in a post-disaster situation? What is their mission in 1 or 2 sentences? What is their mission in a post-disaster situation? And in a few bullet points, what are their objectives to get things done? And for something like payroll, it's probably very simple, which is to say, look, if we have recently run payroll, our job is to get out of the way and be available to take questions for things that come up with regard to payroll, maybe help out in other places. If payroll is due in the next few hours, well, by golly, that's what we're going to do. And we should talk about some ways that we could continue to provide payroll if some of the things aren't available, for, in particular, important people, important locations, and important resources. We won't go into that too much, but the idea here is to say, look, we need to really modify and create and be innovative and work with the departments that we have and not come up with long lists of instructions, but the guiding principles. So again, think of your military, think of your airline, think of your sports team, right? They have within guardrails, and these guiding principles can provide those guardrails. Within these guardrails of what needs to be done, what are some options for doing them? But most importantly, let's make sure everyone, and that includes up and down the line, is on the same page with what our role is, what our mission is, what we're doing in the post-disaster environment. I won't talk a lot about the BAA, but I will say that I don't believe BAAs are used very much in post-disaster situations. I suspect they're not used very much in pre-disaster situations either. I suspect they have become a platform, a vehicle for having conversations that need to be had, but are way too much overkill to get the information that's needed. And so very quickly, I will say, look, would it be helpful to have a list of the departments and services in the organization so that I can be very conscious about going through and making sure everything's covered in the post-disaster situation, that people have planned, that I haven't missed anybody in the pre-disaster planning strategies? Yes, absolutely. Obviously, that would be very helpful to have. Now, as we move away from, I don't think you can provide a value of 1 to 5 of how important any particular service or department is. If we go back a few slides into thinking about that, let's just do it, that post-disaster situation where so many different things are possible and so many different environmental changes and impacts are there, I don't think we can say ahead of time, for this particular service will definitely be number 1, this will be number 2, and this is exactly how we're going to bring them up. What we need to do is we need to push down, and we're going to see this in a little later on, we need to push down innovation, creativity, decision-making, and authority as far as possible to say, look, payroll, I ought not to have to check in on you. You should know, look, if payroll's been run last night, don't worry about it. Stay out of the way, call us in a couple of days, and be ready to take questions as we have them. If it hasn't, then work really, really hard to make sure that it runs on time and execute some of your strategies that you had thought about in your pre-planning phase that might be put together for a portfolio of responses. I don't need a full catalog of dependencies. I don't need the entire upstream and downstream view of how this one department fits in with the entire organization. But what I do need is some practical dependencies. What are the most important systems or resources that the team needs? Who are the most important people they need to contact and who I might need to contact, right? Keep it simple. And again, instead of the 4 different flavors now of BIA in the good practice guidelines, and we're talking dozens of steps to get this done, and including a full diagram of interdependencies. Think about doing a 6 Sigma SIPOC instead. Again, move this into very rapid results. I think one of the things we need to pay attention to is that, again, we ought to take very seriously one size does not fit all. What works for IT is not going to work for a child care center, is not going to work for a hotel, is not going to work for whatever, different strategies, different conversations, different approaches, different portfolios of possible responses. We have to take these into consideration. And one of the things that I want to talk about, particularly in this slide, is, look, we don't have time. We don't have 6 months to put together a BIA. We don't have 6 months to put together a binder of options. Quite frankly, my experience is we don't have 6 months to do anything anymore. Everything that needs to happen in very quick cycles where we're providing value and getting in front of the customer and delivering something of value and of meaning in very quick, short iterations. We're going to talk a little bit later about Agile and some other developments, but again, the way that business is doing business right now, it is a matter of producing meaningful deliverables in sprints, in very quick cycles. And we don't have the time that we may have had before. We need to be very much more in tune with the way that business is doing business. Speaking of which, data. We need to provide meaningful data for decision making, for actions, for investment in business continuity in the years to come. We need to be able to quantify our value. We need to be able to show measurements, and we need to be able to give executives something to chew on. When we go in and we give them a BIA, there's not really much there for them to look at. Yeah, we can maybe drive some interesting discussions out of it. We can make it work. But more interesting is a view of the organization and its readiness to recover from disaster under different scenarios, or different levers that management can switch and pull and throw to say, all right, where do we make our investments next year in business continuity? Do we increase the difficulty of the post-disaster scenarios we're planning for? Do we focus on what we think are our top 10 most critical areas and departments? Do we focus on our top 10 weakest, lowest capability departments? How do we make that happen? This is a lot of information. We could do an entire session on related fields, but let's think about the way that business is doing, or at least is certainly starting to do business, with Agile, DevOps, entrepreneurship, Lean, Motivation 3.0. All of these are working together. We're moving in quick iterations to provide value. We are working in much faster cycles of value, and we're working with our customers. Like in Agile, the measure of success is working code. Well, the measure of success for business continuity should be improved capabilities, better capabilities for an organization to be able to recover from disaster. And we can measure that, and we can improve it. And we need to, one of the things that I think we do poorly, and we'll see this in a little bit, we typically think of sometimes of business continuity as sort of the fill in the blank and check the box. And so in our planning sessions with people, we get them to think in very tactical, detailed terms and ways for fill in the blank kinds of information. And that's not what is effective in a post-disaster environment. What's effective is creativity and innovation set within the guiding principles of what needs to happen for recovery. And so what we ought to be doing is planning in the way we want them to recover, which is to be responsive and sensitive to the situation and the culture, to be innovative and creative, to be able to be flexible. Instead of moving through a very linear and rigid approach to the way we do business continuity planning, we ought to be cyclical, iterative, and flexible, and meet people where they are and provide them the value that we can very quickly. Do little experiments, find what actually works and doesn't work. Again, I could go on, this is probably enough for an entire session. But these are the influences that are moving business, and if we are not working within those influences, and I think we can for sure. We can bring these innovations into business continuity planning and get with the feel of the rest of the organization. Recovery versus regulations. Look, I won't go into this a lot, but I've had many conversations where the upshot of the business continuity planner says to me, I would love to spend my time making the organization actually more capable to recover, but that's not my job. My job is to make sure we pass audits and regulatory requirements. And these are not the same thing. The check the box mentality, there are a certain set of deliverables, and if you do these deliverables, your organization is ready to recover from disaster. Well, I think that's just false. There are better and worse ways to produce a lot of documentation, and more importantly, there are better and worse ways to actually prepare an organization to recover from disaster. And so I think we need to move away and find different ways to talk about regulatory and other requirements. And there are ways to do this. Again, if we can quantify our value and quantify recoverability, then we can have those kinds of discussions. So maybe the last slide here of what I think we've learned in the past several years about disasters. Look, a lot of people find business continuity planning really, really boring. Most people try and hide and turn the other way and not look us in the eye when, oh my gosh, they're coming back to do that annual thing where we sit around the table and we fill in blanks and we decide whether mudslides will have a 1, 2, or 3 negative impact to our brand. We've got to make this more engaging. I won't say entertaining, and more engaging. We've got to, and I think business continuity is fascinating, and quite frankly, working with the staff members who are going to have to recover their services, it ought to be interesting for them as well. We're talking about their stuff and why their job is important, why their services are important, why what they do is important, and making sure that they can continue on to do that. And we need to find ways to, and we can, to make this much more engaging and meaningful to our folks. So here, I think, is a high-level view of the things that we've learned in the last, let's say, decade or two, but probably just the last decade, about what actually works in business continuity in a post-disaster situation. Well, if these are the things that are working, then we ought to take a hard look at the way that we regulate, the way that we suggest, the way that we standardize our business continuity practices. And we ought to change those practices to meet what is actually working. And hey, what works this year, this decade, this week, as we know from COVID-19, may not work next week. We may have to change these as well, that this is what we know from today. And so as I wrap up this first section on how to look at our business continuity tools and practice and standards, what I want to do is step back for a minute and say, okay, if these are the things that are working, and if a lot of the old things that we have been doing aren't working, what if we had started with a blank slate? How would we redo our entire discipline and our entire profession? Well, I don't think we have time for that right now. Let me just throw this out there quickly. I think one of the things that will help us frame up what we're going to talk about next is to focus on, look, this isn't, business continuity ought not to be about certain deliverables and documentation. It ought to be about improving capabilities and capabilities to recover the services, because that is what keeps a business in business, allowing them to provide their value proposition. So I don't think we have time or perhaps interest in saying, okay, here's exactly how we would redesign the entire business continuity industry. So what I want to do instead is sort of challenge you in the mode of lean and agile, where we take little experiments and we do little experiments and we do an A and a B and we see which works better. And one of the important things is to look at little changes. And so what I'm going to offer you here as we finish up this part is a set of little changes, little experiments that you could do and see, do they work for you? Do they make things better? Do they, at the end of the day, make the organization more capable and recoverable or not? But let's try little things and little experiments. Atomic Habits is a great book. It talks quite a lot about how small changes in your habits can make big differences in outcomes. So I'm going to talk about 8 or 9 different experiments that you can try in line with the things that we've learned. The first one is try thinking and working with a department, a planning group, and decide that the only thing you can use for documentation is the back of an envelope. No long documents, no long instructions. What if you were working with this team and from the very beginning you say, look, the only thing I'm going to be able to produce for you has to fit on the back of the envelope. We're going to talk about strategies. We're going to talk about how you could continue your services without people, without a location, without resources. We're going to talk about your guiding principles. What we're not going to talk about is a long list of detailed instructions to get you back up and running. We're going to talk about a portfolio of strategies and different options and creative ways that you could continue your important services. And we're going to document that in no bigger space than the back of an envelope. When we're done, maybe this is a card, maybe this is a one-sheet handout, maybe this is an infographic, maybe this doesn't work at all, and we decide, you know what, we need to have 3 pages or 5 pages or 100 pages, whatever. It doesn't matter what works for them. And have this experiment about focusing much less on documentation and deliverables and much more about capabilities and improving the capabilities of this department to be able to recover from disaster. Second, pick a department, a group, or whatever, and find a way to deliver value every 2 weeks. Think of, instead of a long, protracted process, a linear process of creating a documented plan for business continuity, think about what we could do every 2 weeks and work with them to have these conversations. Look, as a business continuity professional, you know where we need to end up. You know where we need to go with all of this, but it doesn't matter in many respects how we get there. And so if the department is most concerned with ice storms affecting the daycare, which means that most of the mothers who staff their help desk can't come and work if an ice storm, oh great, let's talk about that. What worked in the past? What didn't work? What would you need for it? How would we handle it? How could we apply that to other situations? And talk to them and say, look, you know, I'm going to come back in 2 weeks. We could do a little exercise. We could talk about strategies for recovering after loss of building. We could do an assessment of your capabilities right now. We could talk some more about some of the things that has happened in the past. What do you guys want to do? What would be of most value to you? And when I meet with them in 2 weeks, we have that discussion. And by the end, I better well have at least a little bit improve their capabilities to recover from disaster. But think in terms of delivering value in 2-week sprints. And every time you're meeting with them, you're making them more recoverable. Something else to try. For one department or area or whatnot, eliminate all talk of time. Don't talk about it at all. It's a verboten, it's a forbidden topic of conversation. We will not be talking about recovery time objectives. We will not be talking about how soon something needs to be up and running. Again, I believe what we've seen in real disasters is that these get thrown out the window. What's important depends on the situation. How soon something needs to get up and running depends on the situation and the way that the disaster is taking shape. And what might be important on a Monday morning, the day before we're rolling out a major software deliverable, is quite different than a Saturday morning where we've just run payroll and finished most of our year-end processes. Don't talk about time. Talk about value. Talk about what's important to the department, to the organization. What are the services that we need to recover and why? And under what guiding principles would we do that? One other one, get out of your chair. Don't come up with a documented plan that you're coming up with on your own. And most of you maybe are doing this already, but some don't have this luxury to do this for everybody, but do it for one department at least. Get out and go see what they're really doing. What are they really like? What is their workspace feel like? What is their culture? Can they make decisions? Is it butts and seats? How are they working? How are they operating? Because the kinds of strategies that are going to work in one situation and one type of culture with one set of individuals with their very unique background and experiences is not going to work for others. So get out and get a feel for what they're doing and how they're doing it, and how do we best equip them to recover from disaster. For one of your departments, you might try a 5-minute exercise every time you meet. I've created a thing called an instant exercise, but you can just pick up the headlines and say, okay, here's what happened to this company today. Here on page 5, they had a water main break, or they had a strike, or they had a this. How would you deal with this? Let's talk about it for 5 minutes. What would you do? How would it work? What kinds of things would be good? What do you not have that you could use in that kind of situation? What kinds of innovative, creative ideas can we come up with in order to keep your services running if this bad thing were the thing that happened to you? Don't wait to the end of a long, protracted planning initiative to think about exercises. Do one right up front. Do one every time you meet. Just get people in that habit. Again, we're talking in part about these small habits, these atomic habits that we can put into place that really come to play. And again, if what we want are people to be creative, innovative problem solvers working within set guiding principles for recovery, this is a great way to plan the way that we're going to react. Plan, you practice the way that you play, and you should have that as well. For one group, stop talking. Don't use jargon. Don't tell them how important business continuity is. Don't tell them what a BIA is. Don't bore them. Ask them open-ended questions. Don't go out to gather data. Go out to get information. Learn about what they do. Learn about why it's important. Learn about how they've been doing it. Don't ask them to fill in blanks. Okay, some phone numbers, fine, whatever. But don't ask them to fill in blanks of numbers or here's exactly the number for this, or the way you ask open-ended. Why is this important? What would you do? Have you tried something like in this past? What happened when you tried something? Why is it important that you run that thing? Where would you find one of those things? Do you have an offsite check printer? Where have you tried? Blah, blah, blah. But ask those open-ended questions, because people, in my experience, if you can make it relevant to what they do and you genuinely want to learn and help them and protect them, of course they're going to be responsive and they're going to be a lot less bored. Assess capabilities. So one of the things that I would do, and you can do it in many different ways, don't count the number of things you've delivered, measure their actual capabilities. So find out, do they have the resources that they need within a certain set of parameters for the disaster? Have they talked about them? Have they practiced these things? Have they tried it out? Does every person know their role? Do they know how they're going to handle the communications and a damage assessment? Do they know how they're going to coordinate their efforts? Do they have the resources they need? You can measure these, and then shop out those results to the VPs or the directors and have the conversation. Say, look, basically in my conversations with these guys, what they're telling me is they would figure out what to do in a post-disaster environment. And they've got many of the resources that they need, but they're very confused about a number of things, and they don't know how they're going to coordinate. They don't know how they're going to assess what's happened to them, and they haven't practiced it. They haven't actually tried it on a weekend or even a Monday morning. And so these things need to be shored up, or they don't. And this is the question that you can give to senior leadership. Say, is this good enough? Is this, is it okay that payroll probably will take a couple of days to figure themselves out and figure out what's happened to them before they can get back up and running? And if not, then great. We can start to improve these and measure the improvements that we make. Real quick, pick a department, try a SIPOC. I won't go into what that is. You can look it up. It's very simple. Comes from Six Sigma, but essentially in about anywhere between 20 minutes or, hey, maybe 90 minutes if you have a great conversation and you're learning about what they do. If this can be a vehicle for conversations, great. But try a SIPOC instead of the BIA and some of the risk assessments and some of the other lengthy documentation to learn about what they do. All right, so we take a little break here, mentally at least. Those were the things in sort of your typical disaster situations. These are the things that I think that we have learned about what works and what doesn't work. These are the things I think we would be wise to examine and analyze in the coming years, to think about how to restructure our daily practices and our best practices and our professional practices. Why would we spend time on things that aren't working? Why not focus and double down and really re-engineer what we're doing to do what works and provide that extra value? Think about how much more powerful business continuity would be inside of an organization and outside if we did these types of things. So now we need to think, because as I was researching for this presentation, what have I got next? Yeah. As I was researching for this presentation, as I said at the very beginning, there's very little actual empirical evidence and research that tells us what organizations actually do in disasters. And as we move here, most of the research that has been done in protracted disasters. The two that spring to mind are, again, Hurricane Katrina, and there's this excellent book on the Christchurch earthquakes. It's an actual book of research about what happened, what did people try, was it successful, what things turned out to be things that worked in the post-disaster environment of a protracted disaster. And we can take some lessons from history. We can look at what happened, at the close of World War I, the Great Depression, Spanish flu, World War II. Sure, we can take some lessons from these. But, now that it's 2020 and we have the internet, the pace of change is so incredibly rapid. The complexity of our lives is continuing to expand. There's only so much I think we can draw with some of those parallels. But we can look at some of these disasters that have happened in the last 20 years and take some lessons learned from them. So I'm going to talk now about some of the things that we've learned, what's most important in the post-disaster, protracted disaster environments. One of the things that comes up time and time again is the absolute need to focus on employees and the soft skills. Leadership, frontline managers, directors have absolutely got to pay attention to the health and mental welfare and morale of their frontline staff. And this isn't just in the hours and days and weeks that follow a disaster. In protracted disaster situations, this need becomes increasingly acute and expands as time goes on. Now, obviously, I have in mind our current COVID-19 situation, and many of the things that I'm talking about now are going to be increasingly important as we wrestle with that situation. And I'm going to talk about how long that might be, but I think we need to be thinking about 18 months worth of work. And as we're going to see, what's most important is to continue to check in and to take very, very seriously the health and well-being of our employees. And as I said, this need is going to increase over time as employees get more burned out and worn out, as the customers that they interact with, the stakeholders, the stockholders, as they're probably facing, again, like Hurricane Katrina, the Christchurch earthquakes, COVID-19, your customers, your stakeholders, your stockholders, your board members, they're affected by the disaster as well. And so the frontline staff are going to have to deal with them and their increasing needs. You need to care for the caregivers, and that's all up and down the line, but particularly the frontline staff. You've got to be able to, and again, the one size does not fit all. And the kinds of conversations you would have in a business as usual environment are going to be different than in this environment. You're going to have to ask after family and supplies and households and health and those kinds of conversations. You have to really care for the whole person. And leadership is going to have to, I hesitate to say servant leadership because I don't have the research to show that's exactly the right model, but it's quite clear that leaders who are shown, who are evincing real care and concern for their employees are going to be the ones that people want to stay with, that people want to follow, that people want to continue working for and continue on their jobs and continue offering service. And obviously, without the frontline staff, without employees, nothing's going to get done. And this is what's very important. This is not a touchy-feely recommendation. I believe it is both morally and ethically appropriate and probably necessary, but this is a bottom line financial, no nonsense recommendation. At a time of disaster, and particularly at protracted disasters, look, in the best of times, employees don't always feel respected and important and rewarded. Well, how much more in post-disaster situations? We see that now in COVID-19, where people have to take care of their children who aren't in school. They have to take care of their house. Maybe they're caring for an elderly a parent or other relationship. They've got tons more on their plate. They're worried about getting sick. They're worried about dying. And they also have to then give above and beyond to their organizations. There's recent articles coming out about how those people who have jobs are working more hours and harder than ever because they know that not everyone has a job right now, and they're giving it they're giving a lot of dedicated effort. And the alternative then is you're going to lose those employees if you're not paying attention to their needs, if you're not paying attention to what is important to them, to their values. If you're not taking care of them, they will go. And that could be as much as 50% of your workforce could go. So again, I believe this is the right thing to do. This is, again, morally, ethically proper, but it also is very bottom line, financially survival driven. One of the other things that we've seen in all kinds of disaster situations, short-term, long-term, acute, sudden onset, whatever, is the more that you can provide, authorize, empower frontline staff, all staff, to make decisions and take action without direct instructions, the more effective and the more survivable, the more resilient, the more recoverable you're going to be. We see this time and time again. Now, this doesn't mean anything goes. This doesn't mean you can try anything. What it means is that within those guiding principles, there are many different ways to continue service. We've seen this with organizations that have pivoted to offer masks and sanitizers in response to COVID-19. We've seen, again, air traffic controllers who have lost their control tower. Everything they've done to try and bring it up doesn't work, so they run outside in the pickup truck, they grab some lighted flashlights, and they help guide the planes in by hand. That's probably not in anybody's business continuity plan. The things that are very effective, Walmart during Hurricane Katrina did some very innovative things to open up their stores and provide supplies to people who needed them, and that wasn't documented, and that was, again, the senior leadership allowing and empowering the frontline people who are dealing directly with the disaster, those affected by the disaster, the power to be able to make these decisions and provide these innovations which continue their services, improve the brand, and et cetera, et cetera. McKinsey and Company, again, I have no affiliation with them. They have done some very good work here in the last couple of months in response to COVID-19. I think they've provided some very good thought leadership, but I just wanted to bring out these two quotes to say, again, the research is showing and has showed that you need to find employees that have the critical thinking skills, that can be innovative, that are willing to say what needs to be said, and empower them to make decisions and take action. They should not have to check in with leadership every few minutes, and they should not have to get permission for everything that they want to do. Provide them the power and the authority to do that. One of the things to keep in mind here is that a lot of the protracted disaster, a lot of what we can and cannot do is going to be out of our control. And look, and this is true of any disaster situation, but it's more impactful. Well, that's not quite the right word. It's more serious in protracted disasters. And we're seeing this now. Look, my ability, so let's take Christchurch, let's take Hurricane Katrina, let's take those examples. what we saw in Christchurch and in Hurricane Katrina was that, look, if customers can't get to my store, physical store, then they can't buy things. So if the infrastructure is such and I can't magically repave the roads, I got to find ways to get to my customers. I'm going to buy a school bus and turn it into a bar and drive it out to the neighborhoods and serve people there. I'm going to do food trucks. I'm going to make masks. I'm going to be creative and innovative and find solutions. One of the things that we saw in both New Orleans and Christchurch was that gentrification played a big role as time went on. Foreign investors and outside money and local businesses that had been hoping to get higher value clientele. They forced people to move out. They had different competitions. Look, a lot of things are going to be out of your control, and you've got to be flexible enough to be able to deal with that. How flexible? Very flexible. What we're seeing now in COVID-19, but what we saw in Hurricane Katrina in Christchurch, is that the business model may have to change radically. What you were able to offer as your value proposition in one situation, 1 week, 1 month, one response is not going to be the same moving forwards. Some of the companies that survived went out of business, and they took that capital and they invested it elsewhere, and they became a different sort of a business. You've got to be able to pivot potentially very drastically, but we need to be able to pivot quite quickly as well. So there may be small things that we're doing every day. Look, business continuity planning in this environment may not have the luxury of even weeks. We may come up with, for some departments, a business continuity plan, a strategy, approach, a portfolio, something we're going to try and experiment in a matter of an hour. And we're going to try it, and it might work week 1, and then it might not work week 2. And we're going to have to be able to pivot. And again, little experiments, think lean, think agile, trying little experiments, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, pivoting, learning, taking changes. Again, this just came out in March. What do resilient retail corporations do? What did they do? This is actual research. What did they do during the Great Recession? I think 2007 to 2000, whatever, pick the right number, 2011. What did they actually do? Well, this is what they did. Look, they reshaped their value proposition. They offered different types of services. They pivoted. They were flexible, and they focused on customer service. They focused on the people, on the soft skills, on making sure people were okay, their own employees, their customers as well. So this is a matter of how much you can pivot. Can you be flexible? Have you empowered your employees? Are you doing creative and innovative solutions? Are you being able to move and respond to the situation as it changed? I think we better look at adaptability. And this goes back to, how do we plan? How do we work with our departments to get them ready for disasters? I think a lot of times we take a fill-in-the-blank, detailed, tactical approach when we work with them, and we need to not do that. We need to think in terms of strategies and portfolios and innovation and creativity within their guiding principles, helping them to understand why what they do is important, and in what kinds of situations and what kinds of roles they're going to have. And some of that can be planned out ahead of time, and some of it can't. And now we're back to Machiavelli and the 50% of the water that you can divert and the 50% that you can't. This raises very foundational questions for business continuity. If the most important thing, or one of the most important things in a post-disaster environment, is emotional intelligence and soft skills, being able to communicate, being able to listen, being able to be an active listener, being able to figure out what's going on with my employees, with my customers, well, should that be part of a business continuity program? It seems very odd to say that 25% of my role as a business continuity practitioner and professional is to improve the emotional intelligence and soft skills of frontline and other staff. But that might be exactly what we should be doing. If that is important in a post-disaster situation, that is one of the things that we should be focusing on. And clearly, I think we are not at all. Should we be doing more on business research and innovation? Should we bring back what we've learned from project management, from Lean, from Six Sigma, from other business, for the way that business is doing business? Should we bring that back to our organizations and our departments? Should we help them understand how the organization as a whole works and what's important and things that they could do in line with those things? Look, it's quite clear that leadership is important. It's going to be very important in a number of different scenarios. Should we be leadership coaches? Should we focus more on adaptability and flexibility? Should we be running exercises which really stress, in both sense of that term, adaptability in post-disaster situations? How do we practice the way that we're going to play? How do we conduct our sessions to get people in the right mindset of what a disaster situation really looks like? I think this entire presentation, that I've given ought to give us pause about the way that we do our day-to-day business continuity practices and training and strategizing and planning. We ought to find a different word for plan, quite frankly. We ought not to talk about the plan and getting the plan together. We ought to think about strategies and portfolios and maybe emotional skills and soft skills and leadership coaching and these types of things. They bring up very big questions about how we should be doing our job. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about COVID-19. I have been particularly concerned and interested to try and come up with a way of framing the COVID-19 protracted disaster in a way that will help us as business continuity planners manage it. Now that it's here, it makes no sense to prepare for a possible pandemic. It's here, we have to manage it. But how do we manage, and what do the next couple of years look like? I've done a couple of presentations on this. I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm going to give you sort of an overview to think about this in hopes that it is helpful to you. I think you can think about 3 different phases, and I'm going to tell you that they get worse. As difficult and as hard as the last 2 months have been, I think it's going to get, in some ways, much more difficult and challenging. Let me just run this for you very quickly. I think the phase that we're in now, at least, and I'm going to talk largely from an American point of view, at least a Western point of view, but I can really only talk quite specifically about here in America. I think what we've got right now is the quarantine situation. I'm going to call that a time of compliance and cooperation. The message that we're hearing, the narrative that we're talking about, the things that we're all doing, we're all in this together. We're going to get through this together. This has happened to all of us, and we are going to cooperate. So the most important thing that businesses and organizations are doing now are finding ways to help, right? We're helping each other, we're helping our communities, we're helping our organizations, and this is a time where actually it's quite clear in many respects what we can and can't do, what we should and should not do. That is going to change, I think, as soon as we are out of quarantine and as we work towards a treatment. And that is not to say a cure, and this will take quite some time to unpack, so I'm not going to do it. I'm going to say this briefly, which is to say, I think the next phase that we're going to go into will take place until the hospitals, the medical communities have the equipment, the resources, and the protocols that they need in order to handle every situation for people having COVID-19. Well, that's to say that when I feel comfortable that if I get sick, I can be tested. They will track who's had it and who I've come into contact with and whether they had it. If I get very sick, there will be a ventilator. I know that I can go to this place and get the test. They will treat me in these kinds of ways. If it gets worse, I will have a ventilator, and that the doctors have enough masks and enough equipment and enough testing materials and whatever they need to be able to manage that piece. I think we're many weeks away from that. I think the New York Times has set out a list of criteria for what that would look like. The Washington Post has said that might be a $3 billion effort. I think we're many weeks away from that. In this time, it's going to be a time of consternation and conflict. Let me talk a little bit about that. So consternation it's shock and fear and worry and confusion. What's going to happen is we're going to get lots of different advice from lots of different people, and it's going to be conflicting. Should I open my business? Can I open my business or not? How many people should I have in? Can I offer this thing? Should I go to my house of worship? Should I have friends over? Can I have a party again? Can I offer this service? Does it seem like I'm insensitive if I continue now to offer my regular services? And it's going to be it's going to be a time of exploration and conflict. Where we don't know the right things to do. It's going to be very unclear. It's going to be a time where leadership is going to be very important to us. And as business continuity planners, we need to prepare for that and the third phase as well, in getting our organizations ready for that leadership, for that time of confusion and complexity. Because I think it gets worse after that. What we saw in Christchurch, what we saw in Hurricane Katrina is that as the time goes on and before we can get to a new normal, a time of, and so briefly, what does that look like? How do I know when we're out of this? Well, when we're out of this, when I treat COVID-19 like I treat the flu, or airline security protocols, or driving, when I understand that there's a risk involved in the actions that I do around COVID-19, but I don't think about them anymore. It's just second nature. It's a habit of how far away, whether we're wearing masks, when we close down, when we do these types of things in response. And what we saw from Katrina, Christchurch, other disasters is this is quite a time for competition. You'll have foreign investors, you'll have gentrification, people who had enough capital to outlast their competitors did so. Some went out of business, some changed businesses, some pivoted. The organizations that are the most adaptive, the ones that can find ways to provide new value, to provide, as cliche as it may be, win-win situations, to be able to pivot and find their new value proposition are going to be much more successful than those who try and play a zero-sum game where they're competing directly with other people. It will be a time of, it'll be a time of competition. Those who take a victim approach to this as a sort of a defendant, I think will be in much worse shape than those who take sort of the prospector and framer point of view to take advantage of the new situation. And there will be many opportunities. This new world, that whatever it is that we're going to be in, whatever it's going to look like, will have new opportunities and new advantages, and organizations need to prepare for that. So this is just a quick summary chart of what I've just been talking about, which is to say, this is perhaps the most strategic view of the next couple of years in business continuity planning. What that means to any one of you individually, I cannot say. Everything, it depends, just like any other business continuity situation. What is the culture of your organization, and what can you do? How can you help? Whose ear do you have? How can you influence? How can you prepare? I have a number of thoughts about that, but at least by understanding the situation I think we're going to face and the kinds of things that we're going to be asked and going to need to do to get through the next couple of years, I think you'll be able to better prepare your organizations to get through it. The kinds of strategies that you can use in phase 1 are not going to be the same in phase 3. The narrative around COVID-19 and what it means and what organizations are supposed to be doing is going to change. It's going to change significantly as the months and years progress. And as a business continuity planner, I think this situation once again gives rise to an opportunity to rethink what is it that we are doing and how can we best prepare our organizations, our communities, ourselves, our families to be able to recover from disaster situations. Because I think we're moving, at least for the next couple of years and maybe beyond, into, this is the Cynefin model of complexity, David Snowden, Harvard Business Review, about a decade ago. where we're in a complex environment, and we're going to stay in a complex environment where there are more unknowns and unknown unknowns than in more complicated or simple environments. And our job as business continuity planners is going to be to keep our communities, keep our organizations from the chaotic and move them into the complicated as often as possible. Take this situation, take this post-disaster and any post-disasters, because as we saw, for example, with Salt Lake City, we can have COVID-19 and an earthquake. As we saw in Japan, we can have a lockdown and come out of it and then need to go into one again because of the outbreak and worsening conditions. Our job is going to be able to help organizations manage this complex world and move it as much as possible into complicated and away from chaotic situations. I thank you all for your time today. We have several resources available for both helping you, they're all free, for helping you with business continuity, helping you with adaptive business continuity, helping you with management of COVID-19. Feel free to reach out to me, email, LinkedIn, Twitter, and any other way that you can find me. Good luck to us all as we continue to navigate this landscape and help each other through it. And so thank you all for your time again. And Don, I'll give it back to you to close up.